everybody, this is Hua. Welcome back to my storytelling channel. Today I am here to read part 3 of Plig. The first 2 parts can be found in my videos below. I hope that you are enjoying this story. So pull up a chair, relax, and enjoy. The morning sun rose along the peaks of the mountain tops as Mai Sia stood in the archery field with her bow and arrow in hand. The wind had picked up a bit, and she watched the target ahead of her move slightly. She could hit it, no question about it. She raised her bow, tucked the arrow in, and pulled back. As she released, another arrow cut through the air and knocked hers out of place and nailed the target square in the eyes. She turned around and found the young man who had visited a few days ago, walking down the path. This time he wore all black and a blue ribbon sash over his shoulder as he lowered his bow and arrow. She dropped her bow and marched to where he stood. In her angry mode, she missed her step and tripped, her hands bracing her fall, and he caught her by the waist. "Chaku!" she cried. "Tawg!" He dropped her and she hit the ground with a loud flop. He patted his sleeves as she finally stood up and brushed the dirt from her purple gown. He stood without regrets in his eyes as he crossed his arms and watched her. She said with teeth clenched. Gang Soo smiled. "Oh, He gazed around, pretending to look for people. Mai Sia reached out to slap him when he grabbed her by the wrist, pulled, and had her in his arms within a second. She nudged him between the knees, and he blocked with his other hand. Then he stole a kiss and pushed her away. "Oh, Gang Soo said as he winked at her. Mai Sia wiped her lips, anger fuming in her. She watched as he winked at her again and walked off. He was here for her father? For what reason? She walked to pick up her bow and arrow and then hurried along the path to the castle walls to figure out what was going on. Bombay said as she entered Jillian's chamber. Jillian looked up as she pushed the last pearl hairpin into her hair bun. She stood up from where she sat as Bombay brought her daily medicated drink for her. She took the cup, drank it, and handed it back. Jillian said. Jillian turned at the mention of that. Bombay walked to stand by the door. At the mention of that, Jillian walked out of the room and down the stairs where indeed a young man was seated before her husband. Hussein looked up as she entered, and in his eyes she saw adoration for her. She ignored him as he came to her and extended a hand. She knew this was a means to touch her, and because a guest was present, he knew she couldn't deny him. She forced herself to take his hand, and he led her to sit beside him. Hussein. Gang Soo, Jillian looked at her husband and then turned back to the young man. He smiled. Mai Sia. Jillian felt her heart sink at the mention of her daughter's name. She turned to find her husband smiling beside her. Obviously, he had approved of this before she knew of it. Muhu Mai Sia, Hussein said to Saul. Gang Soo, Gang Soo smiled. Nu na của tua, Nkauj Sia to khai Mai Sia Jedagu. Saw returned with Mai Sia, and as soon as she entered and saw the young man sitting there, her face broke into horror. The action presented meant that she knew who this man was. Jillian gestured for Mai Sia to come to her, and she slowly moved to where she sat. The look in her daughter's eyes told her more than she needed to know. She took Mai Sia's hand and smiled gently as Saw brought a chair for her to sit. Mai Sia, nu no rong nu, mo lần tu to cho có chỉ ư và ư chế, tôi thọ có sao tèo chiêu ông cậu. Giờ li, lo rổ trong, lo tế xế có dỗ dừng lo chỉ dừng. Mai Sia sat down slowly, and then she turned to look at the young man. When she turned back around, her cheeks had flushed. She lowered her eyes and didn't answer. Jillian smiled and patted her hand as she turned to the young man. Lần tu, có tu bao đồ của lần sai lỡ. Có sai nữ vị lý cha, có khai cụ tu anh xe, she asked. Gang Soo smiled, and his eyes darted toward Mai Sia for a split second before they came back to rest on hers. Nè hóa tại, cái lần sai hơi tu ở trò của lưu xe hành. Thầu nữ luôn xí tô được cụ. Cho đi luôn đẹp tay nó, mà cụ thấy nữ ở lần xưa. Lo lù nữ hài, trò cụ xe, khó tao cho giả cả mò. Thầu nữ nhớ rây cụ nhưng mà tao cho trả cho giả. Lý nó nè hóa tại, cụ tớ thấy lý đó tớ cho nên ở tù nè ở gì. Thọ nữ tế ở cụ bỏ cụ xe. Hussein smiled. Huh, Zhong Lu hãy tự tia lần tú Gang Soo. Giờ lì, cụ yêu thọ nông có tua đây nè plá tua, có lần nè có lần xin bê hù lý cả. Có kén cử giờ lý cả. Giờ cụ yêu cho cụ tuần xài mua có bỏ có xe. Cụ yêu thọ nông bao nông gì, có gì có chua. Smiling, Gang Soo replied. Tao có gì hóa tài. Giờ có chỉ nông cụ chẳng yêu xa lý cả. Cụ yêu ý tu tuần cho, là dân tàu lũ rõ đây nè plá. Cụ yêu tu chỉ lũ rõ đó bê sẵn nhau. Hussein's eyes widened and he leaned forward. Có hai lý cả thế? Chỉ hóa tài. Cụ ở xa tệ. Giờ ở xa là chỉ lũ rõ đó bê sẵn nhau. Cụ yêu tu chỉ cho cái chạy là cả lũ rõ. Giờ lì... Có yêu chú rây chú rõ đó? Hussein asked in shock. When Gang Soo nodded, he continued. Lũ rõ nó đó là nhỏ học sinh tao hơn tay lời. Cụ cứ dần bé châu. Thầu cụ là chị. Cụ cứ dần năng có ý xong. Hussein laughed and clapped his hands together. Zhong Heng! Có một bệnh sĩ khưng cầu lên à? Zhong lý có tụi này có mà cụ thể lý xá tao lỗ vào á. Zhong chắp là. Chỉ tao yêu hành gì đi lờ. Cụ xáy có vốn ta. Là, sao lòng thật của hỏi có đây? When Mai Sia tried to argue, Jillian stopped her by putting her hand on top of hers. It silenced her daughter as a young man stood and came to clink his glass of wine with her husband. She watched as her daughter's glow on her face disappeared, and inside her eyes swam sadness. As the two men celebrated with each other, she turned to find Mai Sia holding her hands tightly together. She turned back around as the young man mentioned her name. Nè hốt tại, thảo có chuyện như tôi lần dài đánh tôi bế xe. Jillian nodded. Mai Sia looked out from her balcony toward the village, and her heart sank. Her marriage had been decided for her. Her father accepted the gifts Gang Soo had brought along with him and signed the treaty presented from him as a way to agree to the marriage. The next full moon, they would be wed. She felt her heart pound beneath her chest, her right stripped from her to find love as she felt the hot tears roll down her face. She heard the door open, and then her mother joined her on the balcony with a sad smile. Mai Sia, sao tu xia? Cô sai trong lý Gang Soo yên nhẹ theo yon lu co, she said. Mai Sia laughed. Thật tư cái gì là 我少了那姑娘呢？cái ở nhà bảo địa lo yon lu co lần sai cái chuyện nhỏ. Cái chuyện trai trai cũng một chút cái tuần hành tờ xí lo. Her mother reached over and took her hands. Cái sao đến chơi cũng bỏ rong nó bỏ. Mai Sia ripped her hands from her mother's hold. Nhà có họ chỉ bắt tờ số của cụ chỉ sát lệnh. Thật cụ yếu hại nhà có họ chỉnh cụ. Cái chỉ tớ Mai Sia. Cụ lao chỉ thâu cái gì. Nếu từ có một tung một kỳ có mà bao. Mai Sia turned away. Dòng lý nó, cụ yếu cháu nên đơn một nhót ra nó cờ. Cụ thích chuyện đấy con à. Her mother tucked a strand behind her ear. Cái chuyện nhẹ lo. Lần nữa có lúc xe nhưng mà bị nhẹ. Mù đồ sao hậu. Đừng tón nó có thả. Mai Sia entered the study room and found Gang Soo waiting for her with a wine glass in hand. When she entered, he stood up and set his wine down. He came to her and she backed up. He laughed and remained where he was, crossing his arms. Good chai kula, he asked. She ignored his question. Shake mada chinong kye, kachinong. Kumalayak ko yamuwa. Laughing, he replied, Kutahai la luda kudukai, onde ko yamuche. Macia rolled her eyes and let out a deep breath. Kamachi kaya. Kasali kya kate olina go. Kate ku ujong ying josana. He walked forward and reached out a hand to touch a strand of her hair. Ying jua, ying sa shi di lo pun yu. Kachipola kya. Kasatsa te kasasandao. Yakuchi onde de kuyalaka. He moved in closer, and she backed up until she hit the wall. He smiled, a devilish grin on his face as his eyes sparkled. God Salvakia, Macia whispered. He smiled, and then he surprised her by planting a kiss on her cheek. The battlefield was set with over thousands of green armored warriors as Gang Soo sat on his horse looking over at the enemy who threatened his land, his green flag waving in the wind as he steadied his sword. He turned his horse around and looked at the warriors who had fought and won battles with him. They all stood tall, strong, and determined, for they trained with him. Nuna, tu yen chúa tu chu sa bé tế bé chờ. Lô tua lòng ga kế chỉ sợ, kế ia kế đờ thế kế qua kế nhia. Bé tế ia gan đa nâng đa số, gan đa ngà địa, tí thái bé bỏ bé sẻ, bé tu bé kỳ bé niệm bé gì. Nuna đại ai yếu chuồn thôn trá, luôn tu yếu bỏ kế sĩ tua, lúc tế yếu nó kế qua. Để xin nuna, mô nên đờ cú ý xa. Kế sư bé yên chỉ lệnh. Kế sư bé yên chỉ lệnh, his men cried in unison. Gang Soo turned around and signaled for his men to move forward. They began riding, and he could see Tsuj, the crowned king of New Shikao, on his horse wearing his brown armor with his men behind him. The man was a tall one with a heavy black beard in the front and cold dark eyes. Rumors spread across the nation that Tsuj tortured his captives, whether they were men, woman, or child. He was a ruthless ruler with only money and greed in his sights, and he had his eyes on Dainapla. Gang Soo rode ahead alone, as did Tsuj to meet in the middle. Once the two men met, Gang Soo could feel the tension in the air. Gang Soo, Tsuj said with a smirk. Go hang go ya. Nuna, gu yo chi zua go xia. Go sa sa tia, tao lu nu bong, go yo zha tao mu zhe na. Ho go yo zha, de yo go te tu, zha mu jo go bo go yo su. She le ji bu tao go. Gang Soo smiled. Lun yao hang go de shi lu zha bo pi lun yao. She có chừng lúc có cho nâng cho xe cái tí đặc à. Chỉ lý thầu của bí tùa thì của chỉ chủ. Giờ chỉ của chủ thì của tùa có lúc lỡ hợp của sát tệ. Cơ hứng địa xì lò mà. Gang Soo smiled and turned around to ride back to his men. He signaled for the archers to get in place. Battle formations were settled, and he turned his horse around just as Tsuj began riding alone toward them. Giờ vì lý cha nữa chỉ kia này gắt tụ trò tôn tế? Một tàu asked beside Gang Soo. Tu thơ tu trò, ok ya chi ti shaka, kene yo dom with jay ilang. Bato! At his signal, the archers released their arrows into the air and attacked the first line of the enemy's formation. Tsuj was caught off guard as his men began falling off their horses and he stopped midway. Zais! Gang Soo yelled. Another set of arrows flew through the air, slicing the wind, and attacked the opposite men on the field. Their archers were now taken out and they began falling apart. The king! Tsuj cried as he turned around and began riding back to his men. Gang Soo cried as the men behind him rode forward into battle. The loud clang of the two meeting brought the rain from the sky. It thundered and roared above them as the warriors danced across the field, dirt and water flying left and right. Blood soaked the earth as limbs and severed flesh fell, staining the ground a crimson red. Armored warriors fell to their knees and swords pierced through chests. Gang Soo remained on his horse and watched as one of their generals took out 5 of his men. He narrowed his gaze and he removed his sword from his side. Gang Soo, trả trâu con, kia của mù, Mo Tao said. Gang Soo rode forward and forced his horse to go as fast as he could. The general looked up from the ground and swung his sword as Gang Soo slid off his horse, holding on one side, and kicked with both feet to knock the general down onto the ground. He let his horse go as he swiveled around and ducked the warrior's sword at his neck. He sliced off a limb and picked up the sword from a severed hand. With two swords, he danced his way toward the general and with one swift move connected both swords to his neck, sliced, and the general's head rolled off. His men shouted with glory around him as Tsu cried for retreat. His men began falling back and removed themselves from the field. One of his men said. As he said this, an arrow flew toward him in the sky, and he jumped on his horse, swinging his sword, cutting the arrow in half. He looked forward and saw Tsu with a horrified look on his face. "Nang Tesu," he said as his men handed it to him. He put the arrow into place, raised, and fired. The arrow shot through the air like a beautiful rainbow knife and connected with Tsu's shoulder, causing him to fall off his horse. Gang Soo jumped on the horse and began riding toward the injured man. He reached him and found him groaning on the ground, bleeding from the wound. He got off and pulled his sword out. He slowly walked to him and placed the sword on his neck. Tsu laughed, his teeth stained red with blood as he continued his laughter. He said with a groan. At the mention of his mother, Gang Soo tightened his hold on his sword. And he swung, causing Tsu's head to fly off into the air where it twirled and landed a few feet away with a shocked expression still in his face. Thank you for tuning in to Zai and Zai Plig Part 3. Look forward to Part 4 soon.